Welcome to Tales She Told Me, a podcast featuring ordinary women who have overcome and done extraordinary things. I'm your host, Farrah Haidar. Joining me today is Martina Clark. In 1992, Martina was told she had HIV and maybe a good 5 years to live. With a sense of nothing to lose, she dove into activism, eventually falling into an international career as the first openly HIV-positive person to work for UNAIDS in 1996. During her career, Martina has survived an abusive marriage and fostered a teenage daughter. She has traveled to more than 90 countries and conducted condom demonstrations in at least 50 of them. Today, more than 30 years after her diagnosis, she is very much still alive and is sharing an insider's view to the history of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, particularly as it pertains to women and its parallels to COVID. Martina, thank you for joining the show. What an extraordinary story and journey, right? There's so much to dive in here, but I want to start at the beginning. Okay. You're 28, in a doctor's office, and they say you have HIV. What goes through your mind?
So, I was 28. It was 1992, and I should have been in a doctor's office, but I was actually in a house and talking to the doctor on the phone. So I didn't get the news in person. I got it by phone. Not how it was supposed to go. And basically in that moment, I just sort of froze. I felt like it's like a fly hitting against a screen door, that everything just booms and booms and booms, but they can't quite get in. And that's how that information felt. Like it was hitting my brain, but I was like, did he just say what I think he said? No, that can't be. What does this mean? A million things went through my mind, and I totally tuned out. And at one point, the doctor finally said, "Are you still there, Martina?" And I said, "Yeah, except I kind of blanked everything you said after the HIV part. Could you start again?"
So it's 1992. I remember that. I'm old enough to remember 1992. Obviously, there wasn't a lot of information out there about AIDS. It was probably better than the 80s, right? But there wasn't a lot of information about there. So your diagnosis was obviously, you've got 5 years to live, right?
Right. And it was, so I was in San Francisco, which is also worth mentioning because it was an epicenter in the 90s and 80s. What there really wasn't was information about women and HIV. Okay. There wasn't treatment yet. There weren't as many resources as we have today for anybody, but there was definitely a void when it came to women. And I, for example, had the perception, at least, that I had never even seen a woman with HIV. Maybe I had, but I didn't know it. So in my mind, I was the first woman probably on the planet ever to be diagnosed with HIV. I had no bearing, to sort of set myself against to figure out how to deal with this information.
Now, the perception of HIV has changed over time, obviously. Like I remember in the 80s, people were afraid to touch someone with HIV because they thought it was contagious. Or in 92, I don't exactly remember what kind of the perception of it was. How did you deal with that? And what was it like telling family, friends, other people?
Yeah, it was definitely had evolved from the 80s, but not as much as we might like to think. And it was really, really, really hard. I told my sister that I was being tested, so she was the first person to find out, and she was wonderful. All of my siblings were fantastic. My father was also surprisingly very supportive and wonderful, and surprisingly only in the fact that he was very, very devout Catholic, and I thought that his sort of religious views would somehow make him judgmental. In the end, that was not the case. He was the good, whatever a Christian is supposed to be, he was that. And my mother, on the other hand, was very judgmental and sort of blamed me for ruining her life by bringing this into our family. So that was tough. And then in terms of friends, I I would say most of my friends were shocked and sad, of course, but very supportive. And the fact that we lived in San Francisco, I'm sure made a difference because we all knew people with HIV, or at least knew about it because it was so prevalent in the city.
Yeah.
But I had some friends who just sort of stepped back, and a few that physically kind of pulled back, and then I never heard from them again.
Wow.
And that was really hard to go through. Obviously, as time passed, I realized maybe they weren't the closest friends that I thought they were.
Yeah.
But those were tough things to absorb.
So why were you being tested? And obviously you don't have to share everything, but why were you being tested?
So basically, I was being tested because I just had a sort of a strange malaise, if you will, for lack of a better word, that the doctor couldn't figure out. I was exhausted. I'd had a rash. I was sort of losing weight. My hair was falling out. Not all of it at once, but little bits. It was thinning, which was strange because I came into this life with a lot of hair. Had a really bad sore throat, a combination of things. And the doctor actually said, well, you're in your 20s and you're single, so let's do an HIV test. So I think he brought up some assumptions with that statement, but he basically didn't know what else to do. So he was trying to rule things out. I don't think he thought it would be HIV. He was a general practitioner, and this was not his specialty. But he did it out of due diligence, basically.
And he ended up being right. So you weren't married at the time, because I know
Correct.
you were married at one point. Okay. So you get this news, obviously there's, you're getting treated, etc. How do you go from that to UNAIDS? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a most unexpected path. Basically, I found a community of women. There were a handful of women that were starting to build a community in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I joined that group. And the person who was running that organization realized very quickly I was interested in international everything, and I had actually studied international relations in my undergrad. And so she sort of nudged me and said, there's a lot of work to do everywhere. Why don't you see if there's a role for you in international work, speaking out about the issues for women in HIV. So she sort of guided me onto that path. And then I became involved with a network called the International Community of Women Living with HIV, ICW. And through that, they actually proposed that I be put on the board of directors, if you will, of UNAIDS as it was being created. So it was before the program even started running. Because UNAIDS was trying to be different and be more inclusive of the community they're trying to represent. And so they reserved 5 seats for non-governmental organizations. So the ICW put me forward to represent North America and also all women living with HIV in the world. No big deal.
No pressure. Oh.
No pressure. Yeah, no. So because I had a background in international relations and I spoke some French, I was the person they thought would be a good fit for this role. And it's through that I ended up being hired to work for UNAIDS, and that's how my whole international career with the United Nations sort of came to pass. Most unexpectedly.
Most unexpectedly, yeah. And I mean, that's a big role. Just as someone who has lived all over the world, I mean, it's different for women all over the world, and AIDS is such a was and maybe still is such a misunderstood disease. I can imagine that educating people across the world, especially in different countries with different levels of women's rights, etc., must have been very challenging.
Oh yeah. and especially for me to start, I came from this little world in Northern California where I knew whatever I knew. But then the moment I stepped out onto those other paths and started to meet other women with HIV from other countries and different cultures and different backgrounds, I realized, oh my gosh, I don't know anything because my experience is so different. And of course, every person's experience is different, but the experience of a woman living in Northern California is going to be completely different than that of a woman who lives in Thailand or India or South Africa or Zimbabwe, Brazil. The dynamics are just different for a myriad reasons. And so the first person I had to educate was myself.
Yeah.
And just basically, I'm still doing that, but being open to the knowledge that I don't know all the answers, but what I do know is how to get it on to the agenda and raise the issues so that somebody will talk about it, whether it's me or another woman with HIV, but that it is not overlooked. That was my real role.
Now, HIV as a pandemic, obviously we got lucky in some ways that the medicine developed as quickly as it did, right?
Yeah.
So you were given a diagnosis of 5 years. How did that change over time? Was it just like, oh, there's this new medicine, now there's this new medicine? Or was it that, or did you just get lucky? Did you, what
That's
happened?
a great question.
Yeah.
So my story is a little bit different. I was diagnosed in 92, and then sort of officially the mark on the calendar is 1996, when the viable treatment, the cocktails, as we used to call them, when those became available for everybody. Well, for most people, and then the access was a little bit slower to roll out. But anyway, they were at least, they existed.
Yeah.
So 96 was the start of that, and then they kept getting better and better and better and refined down to now what is basically one pill a day for most people living with HIV. And then maybe if you have other issues, but for the HIV itself, it's really a manageable treatment plan. For me, however, I actually didn't get sick. Aside from that initial few months of feeling sick when I was first exposed and infected, what we call seroconversion, I didn't really get sick again for like almost 17 years, which is not the normal path. Most people without treatment within 5 to 10 years start to get very sick. And for me, it was a delayed path for reasons I can't explain. Nobody can explain. One epidemiologist I used to work with said I was a little green monkey. And I still don't even really know what that means. But
they just want to duplicate you for other people, right? Like, duplicate, give us more time. Yeah.
So for whatever reason, I didn't really need treatment. So by the time I did start treatment, which was in 2008, the treatment had been refined, and I was lucky because I was what we call treatment naive. So I had never had side effects from anything else that were lingering or causing damage or making me resistant to new treatments or whatever. So I started the treatment and I responded very well.
So what did you learn from this? Like from this initial shock of like, oh my God, I could die at 28, which is very young, this is the thought, till now. Like when you look back, what are the things that you feel came out of that? What are the lessons?
That's a great question. I think I learned, don't cash out your pension fund.
Yeah.
Because you might still need it.
Yeah.
But I think I kind of learned that, it sounds cliche, but I learned that lesson that the only thing that matters is right now. And it was not the most pleasant way to learn it, but it is definitely a lesson that has served me well. And I kind of just especially now, as I am much older, I've now had HIV for 31 years, more than half my life. I now look back and I feel like I'm just really lucky every day that I'm here, and things have turned out so extraordinarily well for me, and that is not the case for most people. And so I sort of count my blessings, not just for HIV, but for so many things, especially in these precarious times we live in.
Yeah.
And I learned how to sort of manage my life with like a little bit of foreplanning. Like I got better at not spending everything I had. I think, okay, maybe I am going to be here another 5 or 10 or 15, who knows? So I need to plan a little bit better, but to take advantage of opportunities as they come up and not worry. I think some of us feel like, well, but if I do this, maybe I can't do that. It's like, if you want to do it, do it.
Yeah.
Try and seize every opportunity.
So I have so much of that because I lived in a civil war for a little bit, and when I moved to the U.S., I tell people the hardest thing to get used to was people be like, oh yeah, like let me schedule a doctor's appointment for you. It's going to be in 3 months. I'm like, are we going to be alive in 3 months? What do you mean 3 months, right? And that was a huge adjustment for me. It was like, these people actually like have annual plans. Like we didn't plan 3 days in advance, let alone 3 months. So I can totally relate to that when you it's just a different, and look, it has its benefits, I'll say.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I also tell people I'm a little bit of an adrenaline junkie because, peaceful life is kind of boring. Like the same thing happens every day. And yeah. So it was like I had to undo the adrenaline junkie. Like I get my adrenaline in different ways now, but like healthier, more peaceful ways.
Right.
But I totally relate when you say like, I had to learn that, oh, wait, I might live and I have to plan for that. So I have a lot of questions actually to dive into.
Mm-hmm.
So do you still work with the HIV community currently? And like, what is the state of the HIV? Because I feel like I grew up, that's all I heard about was HIV. And now I feel like the only thing I hear about HIV is the ad of the cute guy saying you can live with it, take this pill, right? That's all I see.
Yeah. So I don't work, like I don't earn my living working on HIV directly at this point. What did happen though is during COVID, a group, I live in New York. I've lived in New York. I've been away from San Francisco for like 26 years, but a friend connected me into a little writers group that had been created during COVID to keep people connected.
Mm-hmm.
And many of them are San Francisco based. And I just sort of like, oh, my people, I have missed you.
Yeah.
Where have you been? Because I left San Francisco and I went off and I had this whole life and I lived in other countries and I did other things.
Uh-huh.
And I lost touch with a lot of those people.
Sure.
And so because of that group, I have been in touch with them again. So I'm back in touch with the world of HIV from, a person living with HIV perspective. And we specifically are all people who are now aging with HIV, which is a whole new thing yet again, because we didn't think we'd be here. Mm-hmm. Some people like me, 30 years, some 20, some 40, and it's been fascinating to be folded back into this world and think about all of us who thought we had a few years to live. We're still here.
Yeah.
And a lot of us are trying to document our stories to process them. Because again, I think that because we thought we had a really short lifespan, we compartmentalized a lot. We're like, okay, I'm not going to deal with those emotions. I'm just going to live through this next thing. And so we do writing prompts every week and all kinds of things come up. Even for me, still, all these years later, there's still little things that I'm like, okay, I'm still dealing with this. And I'm dealing with this new factor of aging with HIV. And according to the scientists, aging with HIV, your body has been fighting it for so long that it can actually age you like 12, 13 years prematurely. So, for example, I was recently with both of my sisters who are 7 and 8 years older than me, respectively, and I could feel that I'm a little bit more creaky than they are.
Wow.
Which doesn't quite make sense. I'm like, how did that happen? Oh, HIV, that's how that happened. Yeah. So dealing with all of these things, and then through this group, I'm also exposed to a lot of the political issues. And the main issue, I think, that's going on now is that people have forgotten. Yeah. And that a lot of the organizations that used to be run by people with HIV have been taken over by people who don't have HIV. They're just professional do-gooder people. And they've lost sight of the real issues. So we're kind of back at a place where we need to fight for a seat at the table again, so that it's more than just the person in the ad with the fabulous abs saying, you too can look like this if you take Biktarvy.
Yeah.
you know,
Well, and I also heard that actually we're seeing a resurgence of HIV
that is true.
because people are, you know, and honestly, my kids my kids are a little young, but my daughter has gone through sex ed and they don't even bring it up anymore. Like I
Yeah,
remember going through sex ed and that was like the number one thing. You better be safe in sex because
yeah.
of HIV, blah, blah, blah. And these kids, like, they learn more about, what is that, the papilloma virus or whatever, than they do
HPV.
about HIV, which is much more
Right,
deadly, right?
right. No, absolutely. And during COVID, a lot of the funding for HIV got taken away and put towards other things. And, you know, if you're managing a global crisis, okay, I can see the inclination to do that. But the reality is more people got exposed and infected during COVID. So the right numbers are going up again. A lot of people didn't have access to their doctors or their medications or their support services. So their health definitely suffered. And a lot of people who rely on public services because they're not able to work, they became unhoused, for example. So a lot of things have happened, and that's all I just know this about what's happened in the States. I can only barely
Imagine.
begin to imagine
Yeah.
what's happening in other places where there wasn't enough funding to start with.
Yeah. So I have a question for you. So during
Hmm.
your bio, we mentioned that you also suffered through an abusive marriage and went ahead and fostered a teenage daughter. So you said that when you were diagnosed, you were 28 and single, correct? So
Hmm.
my question is, because again, growing up, like one of the things a lot of HIV positive people were like, well, having a partner is, I guess with the new meds now you can get it down to the point where you can safely practice sex. Um, but I'm kind of curious as to how the marriage came to be and then what the story of the fostered teenage daughter is.
Sure. So after I left UNAIDS, I spent another year
Which
still in
was
Geneva,
when? Like
98.
98. Okay.
Yeah. So I was with UNAIDS for like 2.5 years or something.
Mm-hmm.
So in 98, I left, but I stayed in Geneva and I was basically pursuing creative things. And in many ways, I was really happy. But it was also because I was doing art, which touches your emotions, brings a lot to the surface. I started to finally deal with this, I'm broken, I'm dirty, nobody's ever going to want me. And gosh, I would like to have a relationship.
Yeah.
And that is when I met somebody who was a friend of a friend. And in retrospect, I can see now that I was deeply vulnerable and I should not have been getting into a relationship. I should have probably been getting into therapy. Um, but this
Well, a lot
person
of the
came along.
90s kids did that, by the way. We got into relationships and not therapy. We weren't millennials. But okay.
Yeah. So I got into this relationship thinking, that here's this lovely person who says that they choose me, wants to be my husband, and I felt like, oh, finally, I'm being seen for who I am, and it's all good. The reality was that he had serious mental health issues that had not yet been diagnosed. So he didn't know all of the baggage he was carrying, and I certainly didn't know. And we should never have been married, basically.
Yeah.
Easy to say that now, all these years later. But we never had sex. We never had a physical relationship.
Oh, wow.
And I assumed that was because I had HIV. In now, years later, with more information, I realize it was more that he, I think, saw me as a project, as something to fix, so he didn't have to look at himself.
Mm.
And then in that relationship, he pretty quickly realized I wasn't really broken. It wasn't perfect by any means, but there was nothing that he could fix. And so this troubled teen was also in our lives, and she urgently needed to be placed someplace. And so she ended up with us, and we became her foster parents.
Wow. Which,
And
talk
yeah,
about
it was
layers,
just
right?
so sort of she became his project, and then she got better, and eventually she ended up going back to her family for a while, and then on to her own life. And she's extraordinary. We're still in close touch, and I adore her, and she's done really well. But that left just the two of us in this really bad relationship that we didn't know how to fix. And ultimately, he was the one actually who suggested that we should get divorced. And I was sort of both sad because I felt like I had failed. I come from a Catholic family. Nobody's ever been divorced, even though they probably should have. But that's another story.
No, I mean, that was the times too. People struggled
Exactly.
with divorce a lot more. Yep.
Yeah. So I sort of put that stigma on myself, but I knew immediately that he was right and was relieved that he brought it up and I didn't have to. And because I am a conflict avoidant person. And then
Also
the
a
timing,
90s trait, but yes.
and then the timing just sort of worked out that another job came up and I was able to move and we could sort of gracefully part and nobody lost face, if you will.
So, obviously you've been, and I want to get into, because you recently contracted COVID as well, and
Mm-hmm.
you have suffered with long COVID because viruses apparently love you.
Exactly. I'm
But
a virus overachiever.
you're a virus overachiever. So, what are the parallels you see between the two epidemics?
Um, the parallels, I guess, the most striking similarity is that whole just mass panic
Mm-hmm.
that nobody knew what was happening, which, having lived in San Francisco in the 80s and then contracting in the 90s and then living in New York City in 2020, um, it was I don't want to say it was worse because it was definitely not worse, but it was just bigger
Yeah.
in the sense that the entire city shut down and New York is never quiet and it was super quiet and that was very creepy. Um, and it was just this sense of we all had the rug pulled out from underneath us. Nobody knew where to turn, what to do, how to act.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that was a similarity. I think one thing that's worth noting is that a lot of the research that was done on HIV and AIDS to hopefully develop a vaccine, which we don't still yet have for that, was put into place for the vaccines that we now have for COVID. So the science actually overlaps in a very significant manner.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that's very different is the stigma, that it sort of hit everywhere all at once. And so every single person on the planet was facing this issue together. So it was a little bit harder to sort of say, well, it's your fault, or, well, that's not entirely true. We definitely did some blaming,
Yeah.
totally unwarranted, but it wasn't sort of, you were a bad person and that's how you got it,
Yeah.
that there was with HIV.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, so
100%.
that part was totally different. Um, but again, in terms of being a person who has had both of these things, the medical response was in 92, they didn't know. And in 2020, they didn't know. I couldn't
Yeah.
get tested right away. I didn't know exactly what was going on. We just pieced it together and then have been trying to deal with it since. And we still don't know. My doctor keeps saying, you're at the wild, wild west again.
Yeah.
We don't, I don't know the answers, but we're going to keep looking.
And do you think that, like, the having both might have exasperated maybe the COVID?
That's a $1 million question that it's possible that I got COVID quickly and early because I have HIV
Okay.
and my immune system is compromised. On the other hand, it is also possible that I didn't have a worse case because I take the meds that I take against HIV, which are sort of in a family of the treatments that they give because it's to boost your immune system to fight
Sure.
off the virus, right? So I don't really know the answer to that. And I think that's one of those things that somewhere down the line, hopefully we'll find out. But totally not scientifically, I can say that I don't know of worse cases among people with HIV or, that it
Mm-hmm.
hit the HIV community really hard. I have one
Yeah.
friend with HIV who died from COVID,
Yeah.
but I think that was sort of just bad luck. And out of the bazillions of people I know with HIV, that's a pretty low statistic.
Yeah, that is. And I have, out of all the people I know that contracted COVID at some point, it was funny. It was like the youngest and healthiest person I knew was the one that developed long COVID, and the rest were just, they thankfully recovered and all that. I do know a couple of people that died from COVID, and
Yeah,
that's been horrific. But they were also much older,
yeah,
and immune compromised in different ways. So, anyway, so you
yeah,
obviously have had this long, extensive life. A lot has happened. I feel like your life has kind of chosen you rather than you choosing the what you did with your life in some ways. But
yeah.
how do you remain positive and hopeful throughout all this strife, really?
Um, hmm. I think that I am, more than anything else, I am just a very sort of practical, pragmatic person. And I certainly come from a lot of privilege, and I know that there will always be somebody who can help. But that said, I have also always been the person who has paid my bills.
Yeah.
You know, I am independent in that sense. And so I sort of always feel like I have to keep going to work. I don't really have a choice to curl up in a corner as much as I sometimes would like to.
Yeah.
And again, that's a lesson that I learned from those early days with HIV. That if you can just stay alive long enough for them to have some medicine, maybe things will be different. And I think a lot of us had that mindset early on. And that's kind of still the mindset I have. Not that I'm waiting for new medications or a cure exactly, but that you don't know what's going to happen next. And I think with
Mm-hmm.
COVID, this really amped up that message in my brain that who knows what's around the corner. So what I can do is just try and stay focused on this moment
Mm-hmm.
and appreciate what I have. And again, having had the career with the UN and traveling so much to so many places, I know firsthand how lucky I am. It's not some ethereal idea, oh, I'm lucky, look at me.
Yeah.
I know I know what the other realities are for people in the world.
Yeah.
And I am so, 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 so blessed. And it would be immoral of me, in my opinion, to not acknowledge that and to be grateful for it.
Has that attitude kind of bled into other areas of your life? Yeah.
I think it has. I think it has in my teaching, for example, when I
Yeah.
work with students, and I like all of my kids. So the students I teach are high school kids doing college classes early.
Okay.
So they're usually 16, 17. And coming out of COVID, for example, they've been through a traumatic event.
Oh, yeah.
And I acknowledge that and I work with them and I say, you have this story to tell, but don't think that you get to just sit back and feel sorry for yourself. Use your voice, and let's learn how to use your voice
Yeah.
on the page. Or right now I'm teaching public speaking. Let's learn how to use your voice as a public speaker and tell your stories from your perspective, and know that your experiences already at this young age are valuable and
Mm-hmm.
they are unique to your generation.
Yeah.
So I feel like doing that helps me selfishly feel like I have all this knowledge and experience in my brain. Let me put these into little bite-sized chunks and then give them to my students and say, here's this thing that you can do. And then it also, I hope, helps them realize that there's that old lady who's been through all this stuff, and they don't even know half the stuff I've been through, but,
Yeah.
who survived to her ancient age of 58. Um,
To them, it is ancient. They're like, you're
and
so old.
it's, oh my God, she's so old.
Yeah.
So, you know, sort of leading by example, I guess, feels like I'm still practicing what I preach in that sense that um, I try
Yeah.
and just use what I have, but
Mm-hmm.
use it for good for something else.
Yeah, I gotta tell you, like, COVID was very interesting. I had two young children. They went through COVID. They were like in fourth and first grade when it started, and second and
Mm.
fifth when I'll say ended
Yeah,
in
right.
um, and they, grew up in a civil war. So when I was in seventh grade, I had the same experience that I was out of school for an extended period of time, except I didn't have the internet and I didn't have a safe place to be. Well,
Right.
I had a safe place to be, but I had to leave the country and all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. So, for me, it was kind of honestly very triggering because I'm
Yeah.
like, this is happening to my children now and to me, but to my
Yeah.
children as well.
Oh, I can
And
imagine.
it was interesting. But also, it was kind of like, okay, this is how you handle it. You know,
Right.
you don't give up. We're going to still do our homework every day. We're going to try to organize it so that it's as normal as possible. We're going to create a pod so that you have some kind of community. We're going to evaluate risk every day, and we're just going
Yeah.
to live like as much as we can. And life
Mm-hmm.
does go on, and you guys will survive, and things will change,
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that was a lot. But I also have a lot of privileges that, I'm, as you are, very aware of, having seen other
Yeah.
places of the world.
Yeah.
So, having said all that, kind of continuing on the theme of joy, I always ask this to all my guests, but it is, what is a weird habit or ritual you have that makes your life more joyful?
So I thought about this long and hard, and I I'm not sure even how weird it is, but it is something that I do probably a couple times a day, and that is I have a cat, and she
Mm-hmm.
is almost 17 years old, and she has become a very mouthy, vocal cat, and she will cry, meow, meow, and I will take her little head in my hands and I will say, "Why are you crying, Sangha? Everything is good.
Yeah.
We have food to eat, water to drink, clean water to drink, and a warm place to sleep. Everything is good." And I say that to her because she's the one crying, but I also am saying that to myself to remind myself how lucky I am.
Yeah,
And
that's
I do that,
beautiful.
yeah, I do that a couple times a day. She cries a lot.
Well, that's beautiful. Martina, it was an absolute pleasure having you. And if you're out there and you'd like to hear more from Martina, you can visit her site at www.martina-clark.com, or get her book, My Unexpected Life, an international memoir of two pandemics, HIV and COVID-19, which has won several awards, including Best in Literature 2021 from POZ Magazine, the NYC Big Book Award 2022 for social and political change, and was a finalist for social change for the American Writing Awards in 2022. All links in the show notes below. As always, I'd love to hear from you about this episode. What part of Martina's story resonated with you? Hit me up on Instagram or Facebook at Farrah Haidar. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you'll get notified when a next episode is available. Also, I'm giving away a PDF of some of the best quotes we've had on the show, beautifully designed to print and journal your thoughts. Email me at farrah@farrahhaidar.com and title it Quotes. Talk to you soon. Till then, chase your happy.